All right, Kelly Inviere, welcome to the Conquering Everest podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh yeah, certainly. I'm glad you reached out, and in your story is definitely intrigues me, and I like that you're into poetry. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's go ahead, if you don't mind. Let's take a few minutes and just introduce yourself to our watchers.
Sure. So my name is Kelly Inviere. I am a poet, an author, and artist. I am married to my high school sweetheart, and we've been married for coming up on 7 years. And I am someone from the Washington, D.C. metro area. I went to school at the Corcoran Art School, and I have just found a lot of catharsis through writing and creating.
Very cool. Yeah, I enjoy writing, and in various times of my life, I have been a poet, a songwriter, a storyteller. It just depends on the season, I guess, and where I'm at. Different things strike me at different times. So let's we get into your art and your poetry, but let's take a step back and maybe share, if you don't mind, share with us what brought you to where you're at today.
Oh, that's a long story. But I guess we'll start at the beginning. I find that's a good narrative place to start things, especially as a storyteller. I think when I started noticing that I was having struggles with mental health was when I was about 7 years old. I started having very severe panic attacks, not that that was really what was seen by anyone in the medical community or by my family, because my anxiety presents very physically. So I would get very sick, and sort of in the same way that someone who's taking a test might get a nervous stomach, I would get extraordinarily nauseated. And so growing up in a family that was struggling in a lot of ways, my mother had her own mental health struggles that she was not necessarily dealing with, and my father didn't really know how to handle that. I faced a lot and saw a lot that I shouldn't have had to see by then, and so it started to manifest in me getting physically ill. And at the time, my mother was convinced that I was bulimic at the age of 7. Things got a little bit better after that. And then in high school, after I had my first massive heartbreak, I realized that I wasn't doing so well. And then shortly after that, I got very, very sick, like bedridden sick. And after years of diagnostics, more blood tests than I can count, terrible diagnosis being thrown out in the air, they diagnosed me with fibromyalgia, because from the outside, my family looked like that beautiful white picket fence, happy family. And so naturally, no one's going to jump to anxiety. No one's going to jump to, there's depression there. No one's going to jump to what's going on mentally when there are so many physical symptoms. So I, through diagnosis of elimination, was just labeled. And so I started having a lot of depression around the fact that I was going to be ill for the rest of my life. This was not something that was curable. This is not something that was going away anytime soon. And I started to little bit of therapy then when I was about 16. And I was there for about a year until the therapist started to hone in on there's more to this story. And the therapist started to pick up on there's maybe some stuff in here about your family that you're not ready to look at, or maybe we can start looking at it slowly. And I kind of cut and run at that point because I was terrified.
Yeah.
You know, you don't ever want to see your family as something that's broken and something that is hurting you. And so I kind of suppressed that, and things got worse from there with my family. And my mother and father's dynamic became extremely toxic. And there was a lot of abuse from my mother to me and to my father, emotional, physical, mental. And they ended up having a very messy split when I was 20 and newly engaged. And I got kicked out of my house by my mother, who wanted me to take her side and everything. And I couldn't do that anymore. And so I ended up moving in with my in-laws for 7 months while my fiance at the time, my now wife, and I were making, you know, the money to start renting an apartment of our own. And then a lot of drama went down between my mother and I over the years. There were times where we were not in contact. And she was somebody who was definitely facing her own demons, but not in a way that was productive. So my father and I were incredibly close, but about 3 months after I got married, right before Thanksgiving, my father had an arrhythmia, which, for those who don't know, is the heartbeat's rhythm changes very suddenly and it can cause a cardiac arrest. And that is what happened for him. And so after a week of him being in a comatose state, I had to make the call at 23 to, you know, say that he needs to be taken off of life support. And so I lost him in 2014 and very much lost myself that day. And I started having absolutely severe panic attacks, you know, to the point where I was going to the emergency room to get rehydrated, to stop cyclical vomiting, to, you know, try to calm my stomach down, to try and calm me down, to get my heart rate to a normal level. And so that was a very scary time. And there were parts of that where they would need to even keep me overnight or for a couple of nights to monitor and just make sure that my heart wasn't going too fast. And I was genuinely terrified that this was going to take me too.
Right.
And then a couple of years ago, my mother and I had kind of her final act of physical abuse towards me. And so we were not in contact for a year and a half. And then this March, I got that call that you never ever want to get, which is that the exact same thing had happened to my mother. And so literally a week later of her being in a comatose state, I had to make the same call. And I had to say goodbye to her too.
Right. And there wasn't, so it sounds like, you know, you didn't have a really strong relationship with your mom, but I imagine it still hurts pretty bad nonetheless when your parent passes on.
Yeah. The thing that is really, I guess the thing that I'm holding on to is there is the person who's your parent and who loves you and who you had all those wonderful memories with. And then there is the mental illness. And you don't have to have a relationship with mental illness, and you don't have to have a relationship you don't have to like it, you don't have to love it, you don't have to have any connection to it other than to wish it wasn't there. But I did desperately love my mother, and I was heartbroken that she could not get help on this side. She couldn't get free from her trauma.
And it sounds like I get the feeling, and I may be wrong, so definitely call me out if I am, but I feel like, was your mom not very supportive of your relationship and ultimately your marriage? It sounds like I get the feeling that she was against that, being same sex.
So you're not wrong about her being against it. The reason, however, had nothing to do with me being gay, which is, I guess, really unusual. All of the things that I have faced are pretty common in the LGBTQIA plus community, but I didn't face them for those reasons. In fact, my parents, their entire friend group was a bunch of people who were in that community. There were very few of their friends who were straight or cisgendered or, not in that queer community. Yeah. And so I grew up with that being the norm. And in fact, when I was an adult, my mother said, that she had always hoped that I would be, gay, because she didn't particularly trust or like cisgendered men.
Okay.
But what she didn't like was the fact that I had a happy, stable, loving relationship that was going to directly take me away from being her puppet.
Oh.
And so there was some codependency issues. And so it wouldn't have mattered if my wife had been my husband or if it had been just a relationship where I wasn't getting married. It was just the fact that I was happy, I was in a healthy situation, and she didn't have that. She was jealous of that. She wanted to live vicariously through me, and that wasn't the path she wanted us to take.
And you said, at what age did you leave her home?
I was 20.
20. Okay. So you were 13 years. So you said 7 years old is when you started to get physically ill. So 13 years in it sounds like a fairly toxic environment. Where you're at now and today, and you're able to reflect back, have you identified what sort of limiting beliefs you had growing up? Just beyond the, hey, you've got this disease or whatever. How were you as a teenager? I mean, were you confident? Were you insecure?
I would say I was outwardly the most confident, outgoing, gregarious, vivacious person that you would ever meet. And inwardly, I felt like I was dying inside.
Yeah.
So I was always wearing this mask and protecting not only myself, but my family from anyone finding out that there was dysfunction.
Right.
Because that's the role that you're given when you grow up in that situation. And I was an only child, which makes everything worse. My mother was struggling with borderline personality disorder, which, if you're not familiar, it's called that because it borders all of the personality disorders. So coming home from school, it was sort of, who am I going to meet? Is it going to be, my dad would say, the lady or the tiger?
Yeah.
And so it was one of those things where you grow up really fast. And so I was extremely mature by high school.
Was your father in the house all those years as well, or did they end up splitting up or anything?
So they were actually together until I was 20. In fact, that's one of those really hard stories. When they actually finally split up there, my mother was attacking my father, and I
Mm.
had to call the police and fill out a report. And my now wife, then fiance, was with me, and we were locked in my bedroom waiting for the police to show up. I mean, it
Wow.
was, you know, toxic is a very good word for it.
Yeah.
But I think that from that, I have been able to, in my adulthood, find help and therapy and
Mm.
medication and meditation and,
Yeah.
all sorts of things that have, helped me to cope. But it's definitely one of those things where it changes you.
Yeah. When did your dad, I mean, your dad realize, I don't know, when your mom and dad met and they began their courtship and ultimately got married, was she diagnosed with any sort of mental health issues then, or was it later on that they started to develop?
So when they first met, I don't think that she was diagnosed with anything. She certainly experienced anxiety. I'm sure she also experienced depression.
Yeah.
But when they met, they were both active alcoholics. They both got into recovery before having me. But that definitely colors whether or not you're going to be able to see that mental health issue. And it wasn't until after I was born that my mother remembered the extent of her abuse.
Mm.
And so she, rather than doing all of the steps that you need to go through to deal and cope with that, did some of them. And then when it got hard, she stopped.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that meant that through the years, things got worse.
Mm.
So, what would start as her having these explosive temper tantrums when I was little became more day in, day out, the personality that we saw.
Hmm. Your dad, I mean, it takes a strong person to, um, be in that sort of environment and be willing to stay in that environment, uh, to see it through. And that's kind of what, as I hear about your father, he seems like he must have been very strong in the fact that, he hear this situation. He didn't know who he was going to wake up to, right? You said you didn't know who you were coming home to.
Right.
And so, in beyond addiction, did your father have any mental health? Like, did he have trauma from your mother's abuse?
Yes,
Yeah.
he definitely did. And it was something that we talked a lot about. My father and I were extremely close and able to kind of talk through everything before he passed, which is a rare gift I have found in
Yeah.
this life. I've lost a lot of people, and I think that's the only relationship I can say, honestly, I don't think there was anything we didn't say to each other. And so we had a lot of closure in that way, which is something to be grateful for. But my father struggled with anxiety. I think the main reason that he stayed was just the fact that, legally, the courts are going to side with the mother.
Yeah.
And my mom was incredibly charismatic. And when she wanted to turn that on, she was
Yeah.
really good at it.
Hmm.
And that's why everything looked so normal from the outside.
Yeah.
And he knew that if he left, he'd be leaving me, and he couldn't do that.
Mm. So, with your poetry and your writing, did that begin for you in during um, those years that you were at home? Is that?
Yeah, I think that I started writing poetry specifically as a coping mechanism when I was going through that first heartbreak when I was 16,
Mm.
which was sort of a, I guess a veil through which I saw everything. I just thought it was because of that. You lose first love and naturally you're going to feel horrible and depressed. But through that, all of the other things I was feeling under the surface that I'd been feeling for years started to just bleed through.
Mm.
And so I started to write as a way to try to make sense of that.
Right. The I'm curious to, because we definitely know, obviously there's trauma in the household that you were stuck right in the middle of. But as you as when you met your wife, even today, I mean, there's still a lot of um, I don't think hate is too harsh of a word. There's just a lot of people that don't get it, don't understand it, and they're afraid of it. So it must be bad. How has, just kind of thinking about your relationship, how has that how has that impacted your life? I mean, have you had to deal with a lot, or have you found, because it sounds like you were surrounded with understanding, loving people growing up. So has that trend continued, or have you and your wife, um, experienced the dark side of human nature?
It's a little bit of both.
Yeah.
I think that it is impossible to be different in some way, shape, or form from the box of what we categorize as normal.
Right.
So if you fall outside of that, whether that's in your gender representation, in your sexual identity, in your romantic identity, in the color of your skin, the way you pray or don't, then I think that you're going to face something at some point.
Mm.
And so, yes, there have been things that we have, gone through where we've had homophobia thrown at us. But at the same time, we grew up in a very liberal bubble,
Mm.
being in the DC area. And so I would be remiss to say that, we had a really hard time. We've been
Right.
extremely fortunate. Not only was my family supportive of me being gay, her family's supportive of her being gay, and not just immediate family, but also extended family. And so I was very much welcomed into her family, and, vice versa to the extent that my mother was able to in her, clarity.
Right.
And my father absolutely adored her. So where family's concerned and friends are concerned, we have surrounded ourselves with a support network that really believes in our relationship and wants to help us to, flourish in the ways that friends can and family can.
Yeah.
And so we've been very lucky.
When you think about, and I'm kind of bouncing back and forth between your years as a child and teenager, and then as an adult, but kind of thinking back, when when did you realize, and maybe this was very early for you, maybe it was late, but when did you realize that um, it wasn't your fault? Like, because I feel like a lot of us as kids, when our parents suffer, we suffer, and we can't help but to take some of that residual feeling that, we're the problem. If we weren't here, things would be better. Did you struggle with that, like a guilt growing up? And if you did, like, when did you finally make peace?
So I definitely did. And it did not help that I was hearing it verbatim from my mother.
Yeah.
If my parents fought, it was, this is your fault.
Oh, geez. Yeah.
And I got a lot of, you're in trouble, so I'm going to send you away to boarding school. You're in trouble, so I'm going to give you up for adoption.
Oh, wow.
And So everything was very unstable for me
Mhm.
for as long as I can remember. And I can remember even as early as maybe 3 or 4, maybe even younger, thinking if I just ran out into traffic and I wasn't here anymore,
Man.
then things would be fine for them.
Yeah, and that's really young to be having. I mean, essentially, that's a suicidal
Suicidal thoughts.
ideation. Yeah, you're thinking that at 3 and 4, and I can't imagine you even knew what suicide was at that age. Um, yeah, it's trying to wrap. I mean, I grew up in a pretty toxic environment as well. Certain, there was certainly some emotional abuse, but I don't think it's anything compared to what you had to go through. I'm trying to kind of wrap my head around, because what that would be like to have your parent, your mom, tell you that it's your fault, and if you weren't here, things would be better. When did so they misdiagnosed you at the age of 7, and when did they finally say, okay, there's just more to this? Well, how old were you?
It was when I was 20.
Okay, so you had a long period of time where you probably, well,
So
you felt like you were going crazy, like.
pretty much. I
Yeah.
mean, I was told when I was 7 that, I just needed to get over it.
Mm,
There was nothing wrong with me. There was nothing they could find. Everything was fine. You're fine. Your life is perfect, which is a curse word in our household.
yeah.
um, because nothing is perfect
No.
and no one is perfect. But I was expected to be, and I was expected to present that. So I heard it a lot. And then by 16, it had all compounded. And that's when I got that misdiagnosis of fibromyalgia,
Oh, okay.
because they couldn't figure it out. And so then it was another 4 years, and I had started self-harming, not cutting in a traditional sense, but using a safety pin to prick the inside of my wrist.
Mm,
And so I didn't even recognize it as self-harm at the time. That is
yeah.
how clouded my judgment had become,
It
because
was.
I wasn't making an incision. I
Yeah.
wasn't cutting the way I'd seen my friends cut.
Was it more of a coping mechanism for you? Like you just felt like this was a way that you could distract?
If I could make the physical pain something I could control,
Mhm.
then the physical pain in my body and that I couldn't control, and the physical pain of, you know, depression and anxiety and just feeling like your world is crumbling beneath you,
Mhm.
everything that wasn't in control, that was pain that I could control. And I certainly don't recommend it, but when I realized that that was happening and I was feeling suicidal again, that was when I got back into therapy. And I've
Mm.
been in therapy more or less ever since. And that was when they diagnosed me with anxiety and depression. And they said, this is classic PTSD.
Yeah.
And you're okay. It's okay that you're not okay right now.
Yeah.
And I've had some really great therapists. I've had some meh therapists, but I've learned something from all of them. And I definitely recommend it to anyone who's struggling in any way.
And you said something there that's so very important, and being a survivor of depression and very serious suicidal ideations, to the point where I came very close to attempting it. Um, you said they told you you're not alone. You're going to get through this. It's okay. Did you believe them when they said that? Was that a sense of relief? How did you feel?
Completely alone and
Yeah.
completely ununderstood. It's one of those things where those are pretty words,
Yeah.
and I wish that I could believe you, but I've not seen anyone going through what I'm going through in my
Yeah.
life. And I think that's a real part of why I felt that I needed to write a memoir,
Okay.
was the fact that I didn't feel seen. I
Mm.
didn't feel understood. And I was told by all of these forums and all of these therapists that there are so many people out there like you. And I'm thinking,
Yeah.
well, where are they? Where are they to give me that advice that I need? Where are they to say, I hear you, I see you?
Yeah.
And I didn't, have that. I didn't find that. And so I kind of wanted to become that. I wanted to share what I have been through so that people know that these ugly things in life, they can break us down,
Yeah.
but we're strong enough to build back up from those pieces.
Right.
And there's an art form that I talk about a lot when I'm talking about mental health issues and my past, Japanese art of kintsukuroi, which is the mending of broken ceramic with gold.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
And they think the pieces are more beautiful for having been through something damaging and having been through something that totally shattered them.
Yeah.
And I think human beings are the same way. Life is going to knock us down, life is going to kick us while we're down. And when we pick ourselves back up and we piece ourselves back together with the love in our life, the joys in our life, that's that gold kind of melding us back together into something new and more beautiful.
Right. Yeah, I've heard of that. I didn't know the technical name for it, but there was, so for me, I mean, depression was very real throughout childhood and my teenage years and even my early adult years. Um, I don't know if I knew it as depression back then, or if because I mean, there was plenty of times where, like you, I mean, I wasn't 3 years old thinking, hey, if I just go do this, but as I've gone back in my timeline, there's plenty of times where I can remember saying, just wishing I wasn't here. And I grew up believing in God, and I would often wrestle with him and be like, why are you doing this to me? What, I mean, I don't know if some people like to talk about it, some don't, but from a spiritual standpoint, whether you believe in God or anything else, I mean, did you find yourself having those same arguments with, the universe? Like, what is, like, why, why is this happening?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I have a very, I guess, unorthodox spiritual belief system. My parents didn't raise me anything in particular,
Hmm.
and they kind of raised me everything in general.
Okay.
It's one of the things that I think they did most right in raising me. So they presented me with Christianity, and they presented me with Judaism, and they presented me with Islam, and they presented me with Buddhism, and they presented me with Native American philosophies
Yeah.
and Taoist philosophies and, European pagan philosophies, like Druidism. And
Right.
they kind of let me form my own relationship with a higher power or not as I saw
Mm.
fit. And I 100% hated God
Mm. Yeah.
because my personal belief vacillates greatly as to whether there's this higher entity or whether it's just that energy that's in all of us.
Right.
And there's a line in a Jules song, we are that to which we pray.
Mm.
And so when we pray for, the world to be a happier place and a better place, I don't believe that there's going to be some grand, holy, host that's going to come down and fix everything for us. That's up to
Right.
us to do for each other and for ourselves.
Yeah.
So when we're praying for things to get better, we're actually praying to the people around us and the stranger down the street and someone who lives in Europe and someone who lives in Australia. We're praying that we all make better choices and that we all live better lives to bring a collective of love and compassion and empathy into the
Yeah.
world.
So taking that into consideration. So when you say, if we what was that line again from the Jewel song? It was so
So
beautiful.
we are that to which we pray.
So thinking about that, we are to that to which we pray. And if you had a point in your life where you hated God, who did do you think that was just a reflection of your feelings towards your mother, towards yourself, or truly towards a higher being? Like how do you philosophize? what's make that what's the philosophy behind that thought? Because it almost feels like you the hate isn't necessarily directed to a higher being that you may or may not know to be real, but it's directed somewhere. It's going somewhere.
So I think that hatred, it starts with, I do, like I said, vacillate back and forth. And it's usually in these times of great struggle that I see that, you know, creator of the heavens and the earth,
Mm,
who could make this stop, who could help, who could intervene and didn't. But I think that can extend to all of the other adults in my life when I was growing up
mm,
who could have made this stop, who
mm,
could have seen what was going on and chose not to.
yeah.
And so I wouldn't say that there was hatred towards them, but there certainly was anger and wondering why I wasn't worth changing for,
Right.
why I wasn't worth reaching out for.
It's and it's so, I mean, like the words, what you're sharing and the words you're sharing are, I mean, they're tragic, but yet they're so beautiful in thinking, like when you just think of, and this comes much later after you begin to understand that you're not going crazy, right? That you you were holding on to beliefs and systems because you were surrounded by it. But once you kind of break through and you, at least for me, and it came very, I mean, just recently in life, to where I finally started seeing the suffering as a blessing. Like I couldn't be here. I wouldn't be here talking to you right now had I grown up with, perfect family and, had everything I wanted. I just wouldn't be here, and we wouldn't be having this conversation. So there's like so much beauty in the tragedy of life. And that kind of gets into, now I feel like I'm getting poetic and you're the poet. So let's talk a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about the book that you wrote. You said it's kind of a memoir. Or
Yes. So I had wanted to write a memoir for a while, and by the time I was in my early 20s, I was starting to try to map it out, writing some short stories and trying to comprehend, how to put into words the difficulties of growing up in a hard situation
mm-hmm,
and make it relatable and make it something that people will be able to maybe find themselves on the page a little bit and see that it's okay to be in that place of pain.
mm-hmm,
And this is somebody who has been there, who gets it, and they've built themselves back up. And I wasn't really finding my flow for how this was coming out. I knew a linear narrative wasn't going to work for me, so I tried a couple different formats. But when my father passed away, I turned back to writing to journaling and writing poetry. And that was a huge part of what I think saved my life.
Yeah.
And while I was writing these poems about what I was going through and what it was bringing up from my past, I realized I was writing that memoir. It was just a memoir in the shape of poetry and poems. And I thought, I don't know if I've ever seen that before.
Yeah.
And I think that poetry is a very authentic and honest voice to write from. I think that we lose the structure of grammar and rules, and it becomes more akin to painting abstract, artwork, which is another one of my passions and hobbies and art forms that I turn to for catharsis. But I think this is painting with words, and I actually have a few poems in there about that. I have a poem in there about that complicated relationship with God that I mentioned, and it came from a therapeutic dialogue that I was journaling, where I was voicing both myself and this higher power, and I can only describe it as some sort of almost channeling, because it wasn't my voice saying, I'm here and I'm here for you and I'm gonna be here for you and your father is gonna be here for you. But that original thing was written while I was shaking, having a panic attack, sobbing in a hospital bed and thinking, this is going to take me. This is not something I can overcome. This is too big. It's too much. And through that came this beautiful dialogue where I eventually realized that's a poem that needs to be written.
Yeah.
And kind of reconcile that.
It's amazing, when we give ourselves permission to be vulnerable, even if it's just to ourselves with journaling or poetry or songwriting, whatever the case may be. Like I said, I've done a little bit of all of it, so I don't really know what I am as far as being a writer, because it could be a song, it could be a poem, it could be whatever. But there's so much therapy in just getting the words out, even if they're not, you're not expressing it to a counselor or a psychologist or whatever the case may be. There's just a certain therapy to it. And I always love reading things that come from that place in life where it was just dark. And I can relate everything you're saying and the way you're feeling. I can completely relate with you. And I know so many others that are going to listen to this, they're going to be able to relate to I'm going crazy. I can't survive this. And then finally, when you let it be and you accept it, it's here. But you got a choice. You could either let it control you or you can begin to control it. And on your website, so it's kellyinviere.com. You've got some poetry on there. I did watch some of those. So is that something you go out and you do a lot of live shows, or?
I used to in the before times.
Yeah.
I look forward to being fully vaccinated and able to get out there again. Because of the level of anxiety that I have, I am somewhat immunocompromised.
Yeah.
So it's been a scary year and change. And, I've had my first vaccination and, have the second one scheduled. And it's going to be really interesting to see what the world looks like on the other side of this.
Right.
Because, just like the damaging experiences that I went through growing up, we've collectively as humanity been going through this great trauma. And, we've had our own individual struggles within it, but there's this global trauma that we've been through that we're going to have to figure out how to piece ourselves back together and find a new normal and, you know, a new what our day-to-day looks like. And so I think that's going to be a very healing thing for us if
Yeah.
we allow it to be.
Yeah, I can't. And I just noticed the time, and every time I have one of these conversations with somebody, it seems like time flies by so quick. I want to make sure we have time, though, to. I'm sure somebody's going to listen to this, and they're going to want to connect with you, whether it's just through a website or your book or social media. So let's just share a little bit. So you got the website, you've got a blog, you've got your poetry. What are other ways that folks could connect with you if this conversation is really resonating with them?
Absolutely. I'm on Instagram. My handle is at Kelly Inviere, and I'm on Facebook. You can, you know, look me up. My Facebook page is facebook.com, you know, / Kelly Inviere Poetry. Um, and then my website is a great way to reach out to me. I have a newsletter that goes out once a month that kind of gives an update on things that I'm going to be doing and events that I might be going to, some insight to how my brain works.
Yeah.
And as you mentioned, my website is also my blog, so I do a lot of writing there. And you can find all of my social media handles on my website, and also my book, Where the Light Shines Through, a memoir and poetry. You can find it on my website. It's on Amazon.com. It's on BarnesandNoble.com. So
Very cool. And then I will make sure we have all the links available in the descriptions and all that good stuff, so people don't have to try to write this all down really quick. So we'll make sure it's shared out there. But as we get ready to close here, I always like to end with this question, and maybe it's, I guess it's a question, because there's so much power in stories, in hearing about what others have gone through. And I can't, I don't know how many conversations I've had with folks now, and with every single one, every single time I connect. It could be connect to a small piece of their life. It could be I connect to a large piece of their life, but there's always a connection that's made. So I have no doubt in my mind that somebody's going to watch this, or they're going to listen to the podcast version, and they're going through that moment now where they feel like they're a lost cause. They feel alone. They feel trapped. They don't know which direction to turn. So I want to give you the floor. That person is here I kind of am here in front of you, but all of us that feel that way have gone through these things. We're watching you now. So not to put you on the spot, but what would be your parting words of wisdom?
it is okay not to be okay. It is okay to be in pain. You are worthy of caring for yourself. You are worthy of making sure the people around you value you and share with you how much you mean to them. And you deserve to have support from the outside and from the inside. And that means making peace with understanding that you're going to be uncomfortable sometimes. That comes from, you said earlier you like the strength and vulnerability, and I do too. I think that there is no greater strength than vulnerability, to be able to have that introspective look at yourself and say, I need help. And those are some very strong, powerful words. And so if you're in a place where you need help, whether that looks like a creative outlet, whether that looks like getting on a medication, whether that looks like going to therapy or a, program, or, anything that you feel like you need to do for yourself, it's not selfish, it is selfful. And caring for yourself is brave.
Yeah.
So don't let anyone tell you differently.
Yeah, that's a great message. That's a great way to end the show too, because it's just so much truth in that word and in your words, and especially when you said it's okay not to be okay. That was something that I fought for so many years, where I'm like, no, it's not okay not to be okay. And when I finally went through the darkest night, right, the dark night of my soul, which was the darkest point in my life, I realized that it was okay not to be okay, and there's there's healing and comfort ahead. So thank you so much for being on the show. I am going to plan on I'd like to do a follow-up with you in the future and just see how things are going and your writing and poetry. So I'll be in touch down the road for sure, because I'd like to have you back on and just see how things are going. But thanks again for being on, and I really appreciate you being willing to share.
You're so welcome, and thank you so much for the platform to allow me to share a little bit about my come from, and for everything that you're doing to put this out into the world. It's a beautiful mission, and I certainly
Thank you.
appreciate it.
No, thank you. So hang tight, because I'm going to go ahead and end the stream. But we get to, I'm lucky. I get to still have a conversation with you. So, but all right. So here we go. I'll see you in just a minute.
Sounds good.